Jason Martinez grew up in a dusty corner of New Mexico, in a working-class town shaped by mines and long-closed factories. His family had lived there for generations, folks who worked hard but never seemed to get ahead. Now 34, Jason worked as a mechanic in his uncle's garage, fixing pickups and dusty old sedans. He wasn't unhappy, exactly, but something had been eating at him ever since he visited a nearby college town for a job. There, he met a young student named Emily. She was from a similar background, but had chosen a different path, college. What surprised Jason most wasn't her intelligence, but how passionately she believed that education was still the best way out. That belief had nearly vanished in his town. Jason began to notice just how many people around him had given up on school. His high school classmates, now in their 30s, echoed the same sentiment. College is a scam. You get a degree and still flip burgers. Studying's useless unless you're rich. He didn't entirely disagree. Some had gone to college, graduated with debt, and still ended up working dead-end jobs. But was that the whole story? Jason reflected on his cousin Marcos, who had been bright in school but dropped out after sophomore year. Marcos now worked nights at a gas station. His Facebook posts often quoted conspiracy theories that education was a lie fed by elites to keep the poor in line. Jason had once believed that too. But lately, something had changed. He began reading, not just articles online, but real books, biographies, essays. What he discovered disturbed him. Many people from his kind of background had made it, but only because they believed in the power of education long enough to push through failure. What really scared Jason wasn't the debt or the hard work. It was the way people in his community had stopped believing learning could do anything at all. He came across a quote that stuck with him. When the poor stop believing in education, the rich win forever. That line echoed in his head. He realized that believing education was useless was exactly what powerful people wanted the lower class to think. After all, no billionaire tells their kids to skip college. They send them to the best schools, hire private tutors, invest in their intellectual capital. So why were people in towns like his falling for the opposite idea? He saw the answer clearly: disappointment, disillusionment. People worked so hard, and when the reward didn't come, they gave up and turned against the very system that could have saved them. Jason wasn't naive. He knew the education system wasn't perfect. It favored the wealthy, the well-connected. But it was still one of the few open roads left for people like him. He remembered his grandfather's words. Books were the only doors I could afford to open. Jason smiled bitterly. In their world, reading wasn't just about knowledge. It was about survival. That night, he sat down with his younger brother Mateo, who was just 14 and already failing school. I know you think studying is stupid, Jason told him, but it's the only shot we've got. Don't let your future be stolen by people who want you too tired, too broke, and too angry to hope. Jason couldn't stop thinking about that conversation with his little brother Mateo. The kid barely looked up from his phone, tapping away on some game. School's dumb, Mateo had muttered. Nobody from around here makes it anyway. Jason felt a quiet fury rise in his chest, not at Mateo, but at what the world had taught him to believe. He recognized it because he had once thought the same thing. He'd even laughed along when people joked that school was a waste of time. But now he saw it differently. What scared Jason more than anything was the realization that his whole community was being manipulated, and they didn't even know it. This wasn't just about laziness or bad luck. This was by design. Why does everyone around here think studying is useless? Jason asked his coworker Rosa one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag at the garage. Rosa shrugged. Because we studied, and nothing changed. That hit Jason hard. He knew it was partly true. Rosa had gone to community college, gotten her certification, and still ended up working long shifts fixing engines. But Jason also knew her story wasn't the only one. He started reading more books, forums, interviews with people who had risen from poverty. He found a pattern. Those who made it never stopped learning. And those who didn't, well, most of them had quit long before the fight was over. One night, Jason came across an article about how elites maintain control. It claimed that one of the easiest ways to keep a lower class powerless is to convince them that education doesn't work. Why fight for a future? The article said, if you've already been told there isn't one. Jason remembered the way rich families handled their children's futures: tutors, private schools, college prep programs. They never questioned if studying was worthwhile. They treated it like sacred truth. If education was really worthless, wouldn't the rich be the first to abandon it? And yet, they weren't. Jason could see it clearly now. The lie that studying is useless wasn't some grassroots truth. It was a trick, carefully seeded in places like his hometown. The more people believed it, the less competition there was for the few doors that still opened upward. He started noticing the pattern everywhere. Online, influencers peddled dropout success stories, while quietly promoting courses and books they profited from. His neighbors praised athletes and YouTubers as proof that school was a scam, while ignoring the millions who failed chasing shortcuts. And the saddest part? The young people closest to him, Mateo, his cousin Yvonne, even his friend Marcos, had already given up before trying. Jason remembered an old man in town who once said, "The system's rigged, but education is still the only cheat code we've got." So why weren't they using it? Because disappointment hurts. It's easier to blame the system than to keep fighting it. But Jason realized something else. Giving up was exactly what the system wanted. He thought about how many young people in his community had talent, real, raw brilliance, but lacked direction. They didn't need just motivation. They needed to believe again. And that belief, Jason knew, had to start somewhere. So he started small. He got Mateo a library card and offered to pay him $5 for every book he finished. At first, Mateo laughed. But 2 weeks later, he asked for another book. Jason fixed up an old laptop and started tutoring local kids in math and writing every Saturday. He didn't know if it would change anything long-term, but at least it was something. He told them, "You don't have to be the smartest. Just be the one who didn't give up." Deep down, Jason still carried that fear, that society really was closing its doors. That maybe, just maybe, the ladder wasn't reachable anymore. But as long as a single step remained, he had to try. Because once the belief in education dies, so does the last hope for escape. Jason began to see patterns, not just in books, but in people. He'd started tutoring local kids at the library on weekends, and the more time he spent around them, the more one truth became clear: talent wasn't everything. There was Carla, age 12, sharp as a tack, but easily bored. She picked up algebra like it was second nature, then tossed her notebook aside to scroll through TikTok. Then there was Brian, 14, quiet and slow to understand, but willing to sit for hours, trying and failing and trying again. After a month, Carla had fallen behind. Brian was ahead. Jason sat in the empty library one Saturday evening, staring at a math workbook, and said aloud to no one, "So this is what they mean when they say talent means nothing without effort." He'd grown up believing that smart kids were destined to succeed, and that average kids were just stuck. But now he questioned that. Maybe what mattered most wasn't how smart you were. It was how far you were willing to go despite not being the smartest. Still, Jason couldn't lie to himself. There were real limits. Not everyone could become a doctor or CEO. Some kids, no matter how hard they tried, would struggle more than others. That was reality. But then came another question that burned into his brain. So what? So what if you're not the smartest? So what if the ceiling's low? That didn't mean you couldn't reach your own best version. The point wasn't to become someone else. It was to close the gap between who you are and who you could be. Jason thought about his own life. He'd always been average. Average grades, average job, average paycheck. But for the first time, he realized he had never really pushed himself. He had coasted on good enough and called the game unfair when life didn't reward him. Maybe that's why so many people around him claimed school was useless. Not because they tried and failed, but because they never really tried. And it was easier to mock the system than admit their own surrender. Jason started journaling again, something he hadn't done since high school. In one entry, he wrote, "There are three kinds of people: the naturally gifted who soar ahead, the average who work like hell and break through, and the lazy, some smart, some not, who blame the world before blaming themselves." He thought of Mateo. His little brother still skipped assignments and spent his nights gaming. But Jason didn't yell anymore. He just left books on the table, shared stories of others who had climbed out, and said, "You've got more time than I ever did." He thought about something he once read. Your ceiling is set at birth, but your horizon? That's built by you. That stuck with him. Even if you couldn't change your genetics, your family name, or your zip code, you could still widen your view. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes, seeing farther gave you a reason to keep walking. Jason found a free online course in philosophy and signed up. He studied at night after work, jotting down notes between oil changes during slow hours. It wasn't easy, and some of it went over his head. But each page made him feel like his brain was stretching, like a window was opening. He didn't think it would change his job, but it was changing him. At the next tutoring session, Jason wrote a quote on the whiteboard for his students. If you were born average, study twice as hard. If you were born poor, read 10 times more. Because no one is coming to carry you up the mountain. But the view is worth the climb. The kids didn't say much, but one or two nodded. And that was enough. Jason knew the world wasn't fair, but fairness wasn't the point. The point was to become someone who kept moving anyway. Someone who, despite the odds, believed that studying wasn't about becoming rich or famous. It was about becoming free. Isabella Rivera had always known that the small town of Red Rock, Arizona, was a place where dreams came with a heavy price. At 29, Isabella worked 2 jobs, managing a modest diner by day and tutoring local kids on evenings that stretched into the twilight. Despite her tireless efforts, she saw little change in the tired faces of those who had long given up on the promise of education. The halls of Red Rock High had become echoes of missed opportunities, a symbol of a system rigged against its very people. Walking home one chilly evening after a particularly exhausting day, Isabella passed by an old community center where a town meeting was being held. Curiosity and a sense of duty stirred within her. Inside, a heated discussion unfolded. Neighbors lamented how the local schools, starved of resources, left children glued to the lure of video games and escapism instead of books. "They tell us school is a waste," one man bemoaned, his voice thick with resignation. "Why bother when nothing ever changes?" Isabella felt her heart tighten. She knew firsthand what it meant to have hope dampened by a system that seemed designed to keep the lower classes in a stasis. But she also held a fierce belief that education was the only bridge from despair to possibility, if only people could see past the lies. She stepped forward. "I understand your pain," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "I grew up where it was said that studying was useless, designed to keep us quiet and contained. But I've discovered that knowledge is our ticket out." Her words resonated, even if met initially with skepticism. Many in the room were veterans of disappointment, clinging to a narrative that justified their struggles. The idea that the elite purposely spread falsehoods about the value of learning to maintain their grip on resources was too bitter a pill. Yet, Isabella's passion was contagious. She recounted her own journey, how she had once been seduced by cynicism after seeing friends drop out and jobs slip away. But instead of surrendering to the narrative, she dug deeper, searching for stories of people who overcame adversity through relentless study. Isabella explained, "In cities, private schools and expensive tutors are the norm. But that isn't available here. We must rely on our grit and a fierce belief in the power of education to change our fate." Her words painted a stark picture of the two worlds, one where privilege was inherited and another where every book read was a small rebellion against a system designed to stifle ambition. When the powerful say that studying is useless, she argued, it's a strategy to keep us from climbing the ladder of success. They know that if we truly embraced learning, our voices would be stronger, our choice is wider. At the meeting, a young man named Carlos, barely 20, spoke up timidly. He confessed that while he had always felt drawn to books, he felt overwhelmed by the reality that many of his peers had abandoned education long ago. "I see a path forward," he said, his eyes bright with cautious hope. "But I worry it's too narrow, a one-way ticket set by fate." Isabella smiled. "Fate isn't a sentence, it's a challenge. We decide every day how we fight. Yes, the elite conspire to keep their power by denying us the tools to rise. That monopoly on knowledge is more dangerous than any fence around our town. It restricts our potential. We must break that cycle by believing that every lesson learned, every book read, builds our foundation." Throughout that long night, more voices joined in a chorus for change. Local teachers, frustrated by outdated curricula, parents, fed up with the system that set their children up to fail, and even former dropouts who had seen glimpses of what education might offer, all spoke in unison. The community center morphed from a hall of despair into a crucible of rebellion against complacency. By the meeting's end, Isabella found herself at the helm of a grassroots initiative. They agreed to establish a community library, a tutoring collective, and evening classes that focused not on rote memorization, but on critical thinking and real-world skills. "We might not have the state-of-the-art facilities of the big cities," she declared, "but we have something far more valuable, the power of our collective will." As Isabella stepped out into the crisp desert air, she felt both the weight of a centuries-old system and the lightness of hope. The daunting reality of class solidification still loomed large. Yet every hand that joined hers in that room was proof that the human spirit could challenge even the most entrenched barriers. The fight for knowledge was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the future of Red Rock glimmered with possibility, a future built not by the privileged few, but by the determined many. Mateo Rivera had never seen himself as exceptional. At 15, he was just another teenager in Red Rock, messy hair, loud music, worn-out sneakers. He spent most nights glued to his phone, skipping homework and losing hours to games and social media. School? It felt like a dead end. He often heard people say it out loud. Why bother? Nobody makes it out of here. But things began to shift when his older sister, Isabella, started speaking up at town meetings. She wasn't just talking about the system anymore. She was calling it out. She told anyone who would listen that the idea studying is useless wasn't born in poor towns like theirs. It was planted there, and it had taken root in people like him. At first, Mateo rolled his eyes, but slowly, her words began to gnaw at him. One day, she said something he couldn't shake. "Innate intelligence sets your ceiling, but effort determines your horizon." He didn't fully understand it then, but it stuck. That week, Mateo started paying more attention, not just to his sister, but to the world around him. He realized that the smart kids at school weren't necessarily the ones with perfect grades. They were the ones who asked questions, stayed after class, and didn't give up when things got hard. Some of them weren't even naturally gifted. They were just consistent. One night, Mateo asked Isabella, "Do you think I'm smart?" She paused before answering. "I think you're capable. And that's more important." It made him think. Maybe being born a genius wasn't the point. Maybe it was what you did with what you had that mattered most. In the months that followed, Isabella helped Mateo build a study plan. Nothing fancy, just 30 minutes of reading each day, a math problem set every night, and one new vocabulary word to learn before bed. It felt like nothing at first, but something strange happened. He started feeling different. Clearer. More alert. Mateo began to realize something else. The world didn't reward potential. It rewarded persistence. There were plenty of talented kids who coasted, and plenty of average kids who outpaced them because they simply didn't stop. The game wasn't fair, but it was still winnable. One evening, Isabella shared a theory with him over dinner. You know why effort matters? Because it doesn't just change your life, it changes your children's. If you climb one level higher, their ceiling starts where yours left off. That blew Mateo's mind. He'd never thought of his future in terms of legacy. He didn't even know what kind of job he wanted. But now, the idea that his hard work could stretch beyond his own life, that it could raise the floor for someone else, it gave everything more weight. He still struggled, some subjects bored him, and there were days he wanted to quit. But now he had a reason not to. Mateo began helping other kids at school, just like Isabella had helped him. He explained concepts in simple ways, passed along resources, and started a peer group for weekend study sessions. A few laughed, but some joined. And every time someone stuck around, it reminded Mateo that small changes mattered. At a school assembly, Mateo was invited to speak about academic growth. Nervous, he stepped onto the stage and looked at the sea of familiar faces. Then he said, "I used to think I wasn't smart enough to succeed. But now I know that effort is its own kind of intelligence. I may not be the smartest in the room, but I'll always be the one who keeps going. And that's enough." Afterward, a teacher pulled him aside. "You have no idea how many kids needed to hear that," she said. Mateo walked home that day, the desert sun warm on his back. He wasn't extraordinary, not yet. But he was no longer ordinary, either. He had a vision and a plan. And most of all, he had momentum. He understood now that most people never reach their potential not because they lack talent, but because they lack belief. Belief in themselves, in their ability to grow, and in the idea that their actions today could reshape tomorrow. The ceiling was still there, but Mateo's horizon? It was expanding every day. And that, he realized, was the quiet miracle of learning.